Yes, recording in progress. Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Andrea Espinosa Carvajal. Welcome to the seminar series, Gender and Health, discussing socialism and transformation after the Second World War. This is the third of our 4 sessions where we will share ideas and explore women's experience and gender-related systematic transformations in health cultures, political participation, and state building after the Second World War. The idea behind this series is to reflect on the role and spaces occupied by women. This seminar is part of the work we have been developing for the project Connecting Three Worlds, Socialism, Medicine, and Global Health after the Second World War. The theme for today's presentation is Gender in Reproductive Discourses. Today we have 2 presenters sharing their research with us. I will introduce them and then they will share their presentations. We will finally have a Q&A after the presentations are finished. Our first presenter is Dr. Sara Mellors Rodriguez. Dr. Mellors is an associate professor of history at the Missouri State University. She's the author of the book Reproductive Realities in Modern China, Birth Control and Abortion, 1911 to 2021, published by Cambridge University Press last year. The title of her presentation is Socialism, Gender Equality, and Reproductive Politics in China. The second presenter is Dr. Esther Barza. Dr. Barza is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of History and the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University. She is a social historian with a PhD in contemporary gender studies, in comparative, gender studies, and she's the author of Protected Children, Regulated Mothers, Gender and the Gypsy Question in State Care in Post-War Hungary, 1945 to 1956. The title of her presentation is Roma and the Politics of Reproduction in Post-War Hungary. So thank you for being here and thank you for the people that are joining us. Let's start with Sara.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to begin with an anecdote from my research, and most of my research is generally very depressing. So I'm going to start with an anecdote that's not depressing before getting into the less happy stuff. So born in 1931, Wang was 86 years old when I met her in 2017. Shortly after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the establishment of the marriage law in 1950 requiring both parties' consent for matrimony, Wang and her husband had a free love marriage. While still living in the city of Nanjing, the couple had 3 children. At that time, Wang worked at the Office of Economic Planning, while her husband had a job in another government office. In 1956, Wang's husband was relocated to a new position, and the couple moved to a larger city, Shanghai, with their 3 children. Wang immediately noticed a large cultural difference, an intellectual gap between Nanjing and Shanghai. Shanghai was much more open, and birth control was more commonplace. In 1957, the couple had a 4th child, and then in 1958, when Wang discovered she was pregnant with a 5th child, she told her husband that she felt she couldn't raise and educate 5 children. So the couple went to the hospital. Wang had an abortion, and afterward, the couple started using condoms to prevent pregnancy. But they found them to be a nuisance, which is a common thing I've heard. So Wang had an IUD inserted, which she used for more than a decade. Whereas most foreign IUDs at this time were made out of plastic and had strings that dangled into the vagina for easier removal, Chinese IUDs were stainless steel rings, which often caused heavy menstrual bleeding and were intended to be tamper resistant. Many of Wang's friends experienced problems with their IUDs, including infections, bleeding, and ineffectiveness in preventing pregnancy. But fortunately for Wang, she encountered none of these problems, and she said that had she not left the smaller city of Nanjing, her life course would have radically differed. and she was grateful for both her abortion and her IUD. So shortly after the founding of the PRC in 1949, the central government dramatically restricted access to contraceptives as well as abortion and sterilization. Communist Party elites argue that the material benefits of socialism rendered family planning unnecessary. Just 4 years later, though, the central government began expanding access to birth control and contraceptive surgeries. Hence why the woman Wang in the opening anecdote was able to get an abortion and an IUD. So one of the major draws of Chinese socialism and socialism in general was its purported commitment to gender equality. However, the impetus to reverse China's fertility policies primarily came from concerns about political and economic stability, not women's rights. This presentation demonstrates that historically Chinese women's reproductive rights emerge at the intersection of Cold War ideological commitments and material realities. So I'm going to begin my presentation with a brief overview of my book, and then I'm going to get into some of the themes of the seminar, or of the series. So the research today, as mentioned, comes from my recently published book, Reproductive Realities in Modern China. While most studies of reproduction in modern China tend to focus on the one-child policy, which, as you probably know, was enacted in 1979 and limited Chinese couples to one child each. And this scholarship tends to focus on high-level policy changes and kind of overlooks the decades preceding the policy's implementation. Instead, my book takes a grassroots approach to contraception and abortion from the early 20th century to the present. And I ask, how did undergoing abortion or using birth control shift from a taboo criminal offense to a state-mandated behavior under the one-child policy? I also ask, how did policy changes influence individual experiences with contraception and abortion? And how did socialism shape the rhetoric surrounding reproduction in China? This project draws on extensive archival research from across mainland China, as well as oral histories I conducted with 80 men and women in 3 Chinese cities. My 3 research sites were Shanghai, Tianjin, and Luoyang here. So my research exposes the messy realities of local fertility policy implementation. Focusing on local politics and individual circumstances demonstrates the way that individuals and government officials challenged, reworked, and co-opted state policies to suit their own interests. I also demonstrate that the state repeatedly struggled to maintain its control over reproduction, a problem I argue that it still has today, hence why I say that state biopolitical control was and is precarious. And finally, I argue that policies and technologies ostensibly designed to liberate women from the burdens of motherhood actually reinscribed or reinforced existing gender hierarchies. Hence why I say that economic and political goals and men's interests were typically prioritized over women's needs. So this presentation offers an overview of the history of Chinese state policies regulating reproduction since 1949. Given the theme of the lecture series, I've been asked to reflect on the relationship between post-war socialism and gendered health cultures. My work shows that regulating reproduction is not only essential to capitalism, but it was also an integral part of the calculus of labor productivity under Chinese socialism. I demonstrate that even at the height of Chinese socialism, there was an ongoing tension between women's roles as productive members of the labor force and expectations that they would raise children and facilitate social reproduction. Whether the state's goal was increasing the workforce as it was in the 1950s, early 1950s, or optimizing it through fewer but higher quality births, as in the 1980s, Chinese women ultimately bore the brunt of these policy changes. So, as mentioned, following in the footsteps of China's closest ally, the Soviet Union, immediately after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Chinese women were encouraged to have as many children as possible, with rewards for mothers who had the most children. Due to China's robust social welfare system, the Communist Party argued that family planning was only necessary under the capitalist mode of production. Women were promised free collective child care and health care, among other things, to help them balance work and motherhood. Some propaganda posters from this period, from 1954, demonstrate the benefits of the socialist model. This reads, "Let mothers do their work in peace," and the implication is that this mother is able to participate in the workforce or participate in other types of political activities because she is being provided with childcare. Similarly, this poster from the same year reads, "Mother and child receive the nation's care," and the idea is that the Communist Party is improving maternal and fetal health outcomes through the collectivization of healthcare. Regardless, though, despite promises to offer free childcare, the state could rarely deliver on this promise, leaving mothers to shoulder a double burden. So this is where the timeline gets a little bit tricky. Not long before this poster was created, in 1953, the first national census revealed that the population of China had grown by more than 46 million people since the PRC's founding in 1949. The realization that China did not have the agricultural capacity to support such rapid population growth, coupled with the desire to get women out of the home and working at optimal speed in the labor force, led to a gradual loosening of restrictions on contraceptives and abortions, and the first national campaign to promote family planning. At this point, in the early 1950s, at least on paper, China had some of the most progressive reproductive policies in the world. As mentioned, the driving force behind the liberalization of reproductive policies was not concern for women's liberation per se, but rather economic considerations and a desire to make the most out of the labor force. The results of the first family planning campaign were very uneven, with urban people and party cadres having better access to these services than their rural counterparts. In the mid 1950s, the cause of women's liberation was sometimes framed in terms of third world solidarity. As you may know, in 1955, the Afro-Asia or Bandung Conference took place in Indonesia, bringing together representatives from decolonizing third world nations seeking mutual aid and unity in the face of Western imperialism. One of the results of the kind of gendered results of the conference was an intensified focus on the shared cause of women's emancipation in the global South. This is a poster that is intriguing to me, and I wish I knew more about it. It says, "We have been pregnant with life, we want to safeguard life." And a Soviet woman, a Chinese woman, and a woman from somewhere in Africa, I'm assuming, but there's no indication of precisely where she's from. They're here holding up a child. And this poster can be read in two different ways. It can be read as a kind of piece of anti-abortion propaganda, criticizing the rollback of or the relaxation of family planning rules in China in the name of women's and babies' rights. Or, and I think this is more likely, it can simply be read as a call for better health care for mothers and children as part of this unifying socialist cause. In either case, at this particular historical moment, women's dual roles as mothers and laborers were portrayed as a source of solidarity across the socialist and non-aligned worlds. Within China, the issue of family planning in the 1950s continued to be politically contentious. In 1957, intellectuals called for more birth control and they were silenced. And in 1958, the Communist Party launched the Great Leap Forward, which is a campaign to enact rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization that resulted in approximately 30 million or more unnatural deaths in 3 years, mostly due to man-made famine. This chart of the birth rate from approximately the founding of the PRC through the end of the one-child policy demonstrates that the only time that the death rate actually exceeded the birth rate and the population in absolute terms fell was during the famine associated with the Great Leap Forward. Otherwise, up until 2022, China's absolute population numbers increased. So the tragedy of the Great Leap Forward made the need for family planning even more urgent. Rather than rapidly increasing access to contraceptives, because China didn't have the infrastructure to do that, the state began encouraging late marriage, wanhun, or delaying marriage to shorten the time period in which individuals are able to reproduce, since the assumption is that sex and reproduction only take place between married people. So delaying marriage would limit the number of children a couple could have in the context of their relationship. Delaying marriage was often framed in propaganda as a way to increase gender equality and empower young women. So women in posters from this period are often featured in industrial settings working or working in the fields alongside men. And the implication is that by putting off marriage and childbearing, they're able to fulfill their dreams in the factory. It's worth noting that in the PRC, birth control is linked to women's biological roles as wives and mothers, as in many other places, and therefore it's viewed as primarily a female responsibility. As such, family planning propaganda, or birth planning propaganda as it's called in China, largely targeted women and women's bodies. Due to a combination of gendered state policies and male resistance, male sterilizations and condoms never played as significant of a role in family planning as women-centered methods. While one could argue that female contraceptives grant women greater autonomy, it also meant that women consistently bore the burden of the physical and emotional burden of managing their fertility. For example, initially in the 1950s, there were no provisions for male sterilization, even though vasectomies would have been equally effective in preventing further births and were actually less invasive than tubal ligations, female sterilizations. Even after male sterilizations were introduced, men were resistant to undergoing them. In my interviews, both men and women I interviewed argued that men's work was more important than women's work, so that men couldn't afford to undergo surgery. In the countryside in particular, men's work was also accorded greater value despite the so-called rhetoric of gender equality. As with childbearing and contraception use, then sterilization in China would become another form of gendered labor. This chart, which is now quite old, but which shows the rate of male and female sterilization from the early 70s, when sterilizations became more commonplace, up through the end of the one-child policy, shows that at no point in this time period, in this time frame, did male sterilizations exceed female sterilizations. And as of 2015, female sterilizations far outnumbered male sterilizations. So in 1966, Chairman Mao, the leader of China, launched the Cultural Revolution, a political movement intended to destroy the ossifying bureaucratic class. Despite the social dislocation caused by this movement, birth planning propaganda increased steadily from the 1960s onward. Here we can see a picture of a health class where a teacher is promoting the benefits of family planning. And you'll note that everyone in the audience, more or less, appears to be a woman. Why? Because women are charged with the task of alleviating China's overpopulation. And presumably these young women are newlyweds, so they're kind of the target for this kind of movement. Believing that population control was the only way to strengthen the economy, raise the standard of living, and chart China's own course in light of the split with the Soviet Union, the Chinese state tightened restrictions on births incrementally throughout the 1970s. Yet policy enforcement continued to be extremely uneven. In many cases, married urbanites were encouraged and later forced to engage in family planning, whereas unmarried rural residents were punished for practicing it. In 1978, after the death of Chairman Mao, the government began dismantling the collective economy and introducing market-based economic reforms. The state briefly encouraged families to have just 3 children under the slogan, later, longer, fewer, then just 2 children under 1 is best, 2 at most, and then finally just 1 child under the one-child policy. These posters from the 1980s, this one on the right I find to be particularly amusing, but the poster seems to suggest that as of the 1980s, family planning is not only beneficial for economic and technological modernity, but it will also make for happy, healthy children. And the text, the small text under here reads, "I live under the party's sunshine." So a system of punishments and rewards was used to enforce the one-child policy, with one-child families being given privileged access to education and housing, while punishments ranged from fines to mandatory abortion and sterilization. In 1984, restrictions were relaxed in some places in response to rural resistance, and after that, only about 1/3 of China's population continued to fall under the original policy, and yet the name one-child policy endured. In 2016, in response to the steeply declining birth rate, the one-child policy was formally replaced with a two-child policy and then with a three-child policy. With more than 18% of the population over 60, the central government is now encouraging larger families to support the graying population and supplement the dwindling workforce. These are some ads that were run on TV as of 2024, promoting larger families, larger traditional intergenerational families. As with birth control, natalist policies also largely focus on women. So far, efforts to encourage women to have more children have not borne much fruit. The high cost of raising and educating a child, educated women's emphasis on independence and career advancement, and recent memories of the one-child policy's brutal enforcement have made producing larger families less desirable. Moreover, the state has made little effort to ameliorate the conditions that make childbearing so burdensome. Instead, the State Council, as of 2021, suggested that abortions be limited to those that are medically necessary. Although for most of recent Chinese history, abortion was widely available and sometimes even mandated, in some ways the end result has not significantly differed from circumstances in countries that limit access to abortion and contraception. In either case, individual women bear the brunt of state policies that privilege political and economic agendas over reproductive autonomy. Without improvements to social services like education, healthcare, and childcare, these policies simply reproduce existing socioeconomic and gender inequalities. Unfortunately, modern Chinese history shows that patriarchal social norms and the blind pursuit of state goals, whether under Chinese communism or capitalism, disadvantage women. Although socialism may have offered a new way forward for women, in China, it did not deliver on that promise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Those posters were amazing. Beautiful, beautiful visual aids. Thank you for that, Esther. You can start now.
Okay, so I'll share. Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about reproductive politics in post-war Eastern Europe with a case study then in the second half of my presentation on Hungary and as it related to Roma. This presentation is based on existing research, so some of my publications. And the section title for today highlights gender and reproductive discourses, but I'm going to also look at how race, ethnicity, and class intersected with gender in reproductive politics. And I'm going to start with a more and with a broader outlook at the global trends in reproductive politics, especially in the global north, and then focused on the state socialist part of Europe with particular attention to gender politics and politics regarding Roma. And then I'll move on to the Hungarian case study, where I also will be discussing, besides discourses, some policymaking and practices. So looking at some of the most important factors that played into reproductive politics after World War II was the Cold War East-West divide. And here we need to mention the UN-driven population control politics that was actually developed by policy experts already in the 1940s in the US, who studied demographic transition theory, or proposed this demographic theory, transition theory, and divided the world along a scale that was set up based on the different countries' levels of industrialization, modernization, and accompanying drop in fertility rates and mortality rates. And so at the high end of this scale were the industrialized countries, so-called first world countries, that already went through this demographic transition, and so-called second and third world countries were still on the way towards achieving this transition. And so policy experts actually advocated long-term economic aid and development projects, but fear of the so-called population bomb coming from the global south gave rise to a family planning industry instead, and short-term projects directed at population control that were brought to, especially to third world countries, in the framework of development programs. And then we also have to talk about neo-Malthusian theory that played a role even in the post-World War II context. Malthus was an 18th century economist who was one of the first to warn about the social and economic dangers of unlimited birth, and ensuing birth control efforts actually involved or targeted especially the lower classes, and later also involved ethnic racial differentiation. And eugenics also played a role, or intertwined later in Malthusian with Malthusianism. So the word dysgenic already signifies this. So efforts towards birth control involved stopping population growth, especially among those who were perceived to be dysgenic or so-called unhealthy. And so this brings us to the survival of eugenics across the World War II divide. I'm not going to go into the different pre-war branches of eugenics thought and its post-war developments. Important to notice that new fields emerge due to technological developments such as prenatal diagnosis and other new reproductive technologies that embed eugenics thought. And both positive and negative eugenic practices existed also in the post-war decades across Europe. New eugenics was also adapted to the state socialist context, and instead of race embetterment, arguments focused about socialist morality and and socialist subjects were encouraged to keep to the idea of healthy birth that I'm going to talk about just in a minute. And this also combined with covered forms of racism targeting Roma that I'm also going to address. So Sarah has already talked a little bit about family planning. And this had an East-West divide that affected Eastern European reproductive politics, because in Eastern Europe, as opposed to the birth control drive coming from the global north, in Eastern Europe, as Sarah also mentioned, also in the Chinese context, there was a belief that material access is going to bring about an automatic increase in welfare and accompanying increase in fertility rates. And as this has not happened, pronatalist drives were put in practice. So in the 1950s, these focused more on quantitative growth. And from the 1960s, mid-1960s onwards, emphasis on quality birth increased, and family planning was the way to implement these policies. So which were mostly welfare and social policies. Then moving on to some of the main characteristics of gender politics in state socialist Europe, it's what I would like to mention is the difference between the early phase and the later decades of state socialism, while especially in the Stalinist years, there was greater effort towards equalizing women and men. From the mid-1960s onwards, more attention was paid to women's difference, and emphasis was placed on women's roles as mothers. So while in the 1950s, numerous legal measures were put in place to increase equality between men and women, the later decades were characterized by an emphasis on women's difference, and it was especially, as Sarah also mentioned, the double burden and the inadequate socialization of care work, unpaid work, household work, and care work that led to tensions, especially in women's lives, between their responsibilities in the field of employment and in unpaid work. In the second half of the 1960s, in numerous countries, maternity benefits were introduced to offer women a choice to be able to choose whether to stay in employment or take a maternity benefit, a maternity leave. Sorry, and it was assured that women could return to their jobs after the end of this maternity period. Let me say a couple of words about policies targeting Roma. As Celia Donert has pointed out in relation to state socialist Czechoslovakia. Similarly, we can say this also about Hungary. The Stalinist phase was more dominated, as also in terms of gender politics, with an effort to emancipate Roma through their involvement in paid work, in productive work. And this targeted their assimilation and they were also perceived, as opposed to a racial or ethnic group, rather they were approached as a social layer who were to assimilate to the majorities through their participation in paid work. And then, as this politics has not brought about the expected results, from the 1960s onwards, or already by the end of the 1950s, more emphasis was put on women's, on the difference, on Roma's difference, with a focus on their biological and so-called natural difference. That was to explain the failure of their assimilation and the persistence of poverty among Roma. And Roma were categorized according to their perceived willingness to work, and on a scale of assimilated, semi-assimilated, and not assimilated. Not assimilated basically equal to being work shy, being perceived as work shy. Here are some figures on, or some more information on pronatalist policies, with attention to abortion from Hungary. While in the early 1950s, in practice, abortion was banned, although this was embedded in a decree, or in consequence of a decree on the protection of mothers and children. So abortion was legalized, but it was very restricted. It was then, following the legalization in the USSR, liberalized in Hungary in '56, and as a result of the high number of abortions in the 1960s and consequent concerns about dropping fertility rates, abortion was further restricted in the 70s and the 80s. And high abortion rates were also related to the fact that other contraceptive methods were not available until the second half of the 60s and the 70s. So let me turn now to the Hungarian case study. And to this, I would just like to go back to pronatalism and the way gender, race, ethnicity, and class intersected with pronatalist politics, which resulted in selective pronatalism, which was especially characteristic to the decades of between the mid-1960s and the 1980s in Hungary. And this meant that only certain groups of women were encouraged to give birth to more children. And these were women who belonged to better-to-do strata and had better educational background, while other women from poorer backgrounds and less educated were discouraged from giving more birth. This was also already in the period when family, in the framework of family planning, not unlimited birth and an unlimited increase in family size was propagated, but already a limited number of children were desired. That is, families with 2 to 3 children, and so-called large families who were seen to be large already, above 4 children, were not that welcome. And this approach to family planning and the healthy family was intertwined with eugenic ideas, and also overlapped with the way Romani fertility was discussed. And an example a policy example from Hungary is from the early 1960s already, where in the Ministry of Health, physicians, the Ministry of Health encouraged physicians to popularize abortion among Romani women, which is startling because this was the time period when abortion was very much decried and women in general were very much discouraged from turning to abortion. And in the closing part of my presentation now, I would like to bring you this brochure and a short analysis of this brochure that demonstrates the way selective family planning, selective pronatalism targeted Roma. It's a brochure that was published, written and designed by a Hungarian physician, and published both in Hungarian and in Romanes, which means that it especially targeted those Roma who lived in the northeastern part of Hungary, a poorer part of Hungary, and inhabited by Roma who were mostly identified as unassimilated and often as work shy. And the publication is also illustrated by photographs by the author, and its structure is interesting because it places on the left side always the bad example, and on the right side the good one. And these opposing images, and it was accompanied by also opposing images, and all dealt with health and different aspects of healthiness and unhealthiness. Here in the first, in these two images, we can see dirt and cleanliness as it related to unhealthiness and healthiness. And these photographs also made use of long-standing topoi in the way Roma were portrayed in the history of ethnographic photography, in which often Roma were pictured in a natural environment. The photograph often was occupied by large parts of nature, bringing this association between Roma and irresponsibility, or the child of nature. And this is what we can see a little bit in these two pictures as well. On the right-hand side, we see a more organized, although outside environment, but in a park, in an organized environment. And I would I would also like to draw attention to the language of this brochure, which brought all the responsibility to Roma themselves. So as you can see from this citation, it encouraged Roma to be responsible and follow hygienic measures, but at no point was there mention of the fact that Romani settlements were often, mostly not attached to sewage systems, and there was no running water available. And different aspects of healthiness and unhealthiness were addressed, also in relation to children and providing for children adequately in terms of feeding children, but also, as we can see here, not only adequate nutrition, but also the way this was to be provided and presented was addressed. So the example here talks about how even cheap food should be placed in a tasteful manner on a table, which was the example to be followed. And then much of healthiness and health was related to fertility practices. So giving birth at a too early or too late age was described as unhealthy, as well as too frequent births. And as you can see, this brochure also advocated the use of contraceptives for women. And this is the last picture or couple of pictures that I would like to talk about, which clearly illustrates anti-natalist efforts targeting Romani women. Because on the left-hand side, we can see the so-called large family that is that was perceived as a burden on the state because parents were expected not to be able to support the raising of these children. And the ideal family, the ideal Roma family, was a small family with a maximum of 2 children and 2 parents. These are just enlarged versions of these 2 pictures. And this, again, I would like to bring up the parallel or similar example from Czechoslovakia, where in 1972, following the introduction of a sterilization decree that was ethnically neutral, enforced sterilizations so forced sterilizations targeted mostly Romani women. And I would like to close here my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much for these 2 fantastic presentations. I'm quite excited about hearing about your work. Really, thank you. Shall we start with questions? I want to invite people to start asking questions about the presentation. Do we have yes, Rebecca.
Yeah, before I ask the question, I just want to say thank you so much for both of the presentations and to Andrea for organizing. This is great. I'm especially interested because I also work on reproduction and family planning. My work is on India in the 20th century. So I'm really interested to see the parallels and differences in your stories. So one of the things I'm really curious about in your cases is if and how masculinities come into these stories. And this is something that I've been trying to unpick in the India case, because as no doubt you're already aware, India is one of the few places where men were targeted in large numbers. And one of the things that happens in India is that men are very clearly constructed as kind of cognitive subjects, and they have to be enlisted into family planning campaigns and reproductive decision-making because they're understood to be principal decision makers within the family, within the household, particularly around kind of economic rationality around family size and structure. So I'm really interested to know if men are brought into your stories. Are they constructed, and in what ways the masculinity is constructed in those stories around reproduction? And I have a specific question for Sarah. I was really interested in your sterilization chart because I've just made a very similar one for India. So I'm very curious. And I'm particularly interested to know, in the earlier period, women are still the majority of sterilizations, but in some years there are kind of significant numbers of men sterilized. And it seems kind of self-evident how women are recruited as, sterilization cases because they're easily accessed via maternal and child health services, obstetric health services. They're constructed as mothers and as biological and social subjects around reproduction. How are men enlisted for sterilization in the case in China? I'm just really curious to know. Okay, I'll stop talking.
Esther, do you want to begin?
Yes, thank you. I can just shortly say something about this. In the Hungarian case, the gendered difference here in selective pronatalism was that they were mostly women, as I could see the targets of these politics, and recalling the Czechoslovakian forced sterilization cases, women's recollections did raise the role of husbands and their partners in the phase after these sterilizations took place, but the way actors, I mean, institutional representatives acted was more towards women, as Sarah has also mentioned with relation to China.
As for masculinity in my stories, this is something I've been sort of trying to tease out, at least in the Chinese case, and especially in comparison to India, because I think there are a lot of really interesting parallels. And I wrote an article, I don't know if it's going to ever be published, but I did write an article that talks about these ideas of men in India and China, how they're kind of portrayed as passive or active decision makers in family planning. And there's this interesting kind of conversation in the early and mid 1950s in China in particular, but also between China and India, Chinese and Indian leaders, about how best to get men involved in family planning. And there are a few people who say that actually men are the obvious choice for to be the target of sterilizations. At least in the Chinese context, that idea falls on deaf ears. There's like a blip moment where there's a few like a kind of half-hearted effort to enlist men into the cause of family planning. There's a few posters that say family planning, men are there too for the act, men should be involved. And that quickly goes away and is replaced by more rhetoric of it's the woman's responsibility. So oddly enough, even though like sexual hygiene guides from the 50s and 60s portray men as active, they actively orgasm, they actively initiate sex, they're more just active. Somehow they don't seem to have much to do with the family planning process, and it's largely like plays and films and brochures and classes on family planning all target women, because men, I guess, are just too busy doing other things to be bothered with this. But it's interesting how men are both portrayed as more active, and yet they're more passive when it comes to family planning. As to your excellent question about sterilization rates, in the 1980s, I believe, there were like two periods of these things called like crackdowns or campaigns that directly did target men for sterilization. And that does stand apart from other parts of the world, not except for India. However, these movements were highly unpopular, and it was decided essentially that it was better to focus on not alienating men for the greater goal of limiting fertility than pissing them off simultaneously. So men were generally, the consensus was that sterilization was not only emasculating, but it actually like imbalanced or put the balance of yin and yang in the body into imbalance, which could produce all sorts of negative health problems. So it wasn't just about masculinity, it was about basically forcing these men to be unhealthy and sickly for the rest of their lives.
Thank you. So interesting.
If I may add just another note that that in the 70s and 80s, I mean, in different contexts, in not all state socialist contexts, but it did appear in sex education material, an effort and a note on the need to create a more equal gendered relation and balance in the distribution of household work between men and women. So in some of these countries, for example, in Eastern Germany, there were some very progressive sex education material that did raise this, or some persons did address this also in the Hungarian context.
Thank you so much. There is another raised hand in the audience. Is it Priskako? Yeah.
Hi, yeah, Priska, sorry. Yeah, that was so interesting. Also, the like having them next to each other. I've never really considered like the Chinese case next to the Eastern European case, but that makes sense. But yeah, I have a couple of questions. So first, kind of adding to this masculinity question, I was wondering if you've looked at sort of legislation or discourse around like child support and divorce or like as a way of forcing men to take family planning seriously. I don't know if that's maybe one way that you could approach the men, and also whether you have any sort of evidence or any kind of sources you could think of where that show like men taking on ideas about family planning independently, like even if they're not being targeted, but just like, I don't know, through oral histories or something, that they actually do think about like the size of their family and what it means for them as a family unit. Because I feel like well, I don't know, I've seen like statistics and stuff where actually the withdrawal method is still like the most commonly used form of contraception in like the 70s. So I feel like that kind of doesn't get that much attention when we talk about contraception. So I don't know if you know anything about that, or if you can say something about that. And then a final question for Esther is there any sort of response from Roma activists or Romani women about this at the time or afterwards, or like them pushing back against these things and this portrayal of themselves? Yeah, thank you.
I don't have a great answer to your question about child support, and I wish I did. That's a fantastic point of like entry into the question of male accountability, and it's something I would like to pursue further. I have a quick anecdote, and then I'll leave it to Esther. But about your point about examples of men having either like internalized responsibility or just having it on their own. As much as man bashing is fun, one reason why I began my presentation with an anecdote, the anecdote I chose, is because I think we can see in that instance the woman decides she wants an abortion and the husband says, okay, that's fine, you know best, you know your body best, and that's it's a kind of consensual and mutual decision. And I did find in some of my oral histories that was the case. And some people even, like, these are very elderly folks, so they're reflecting on things that happened, 40 or 50 years ago. But some would say, almost repeat verbatim the language from a poster they had read when they were young that said, like, reproduction is everybody's responsibility, male or female, do your part. And so I know that some people, to some extent, even at least superficially, had kind of taken that rhetoric to heart. But I also found that, at least in some very like well-educated families, the man would defer to his wife's decision, whatever she wanted to do. If she wanted to have more children, if she didn't want to have more children, if she wanted to have an IUD inserted, he would say, "Okay, I support you in whatever you want to do," which is nice.
Yeah, starting with the second question, I would again mention the case of Czechia, where that's the most known case, where much has already been taken on by Roma and Romani women to address the grievances, and I mean, numerous court cases already have also taken place, and there are also support groups that Roma have established for supporting not only Roma victims. With reference to the first question, I mean, I can just turn back to the sex education material as an example. And again, to the East German case, I think Dagmar Herzog has referred to such sex education material that also involved the education of men, especially in the late 70s and the 80s. Some of the more progressive material try to teach better sexual techniques, and then as a result, a questionnaire about sexual life that compared men and women's experiences, I think in 89 or something like that, when the questionnaire was conducted in West and East Germany. It turned out that Eastern German women had better sex than Western women.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I will take your question in a minute, but let me first read Agatha's question that is in the chat. So Agatha says, thank you so much for these interesting presentations. My question to both of you was around the role of contraceptive and reproductive technologies in both policies and practice. You both discuss sterilization technologies, but I also wonder about the fetal screening technologies or abortion technologies and how they serve or maybe even transform policies. Thank you for that question, Agatha.
I could say thank you for this question, which is a very interesting question, but unfortunately I haven't looked into this aspect of the history of reproductive politics, but it's a great question.
As to fetal screening technologies arrived in China, I think in the early or mid 80s, and quickly became pretty widespread. So much to the point where the birth rate was strikingly in favor of male babies. In some places, it was something like there were twice as many male babies being born as female babies. And the Communist Party at first denied that anything was going on, that these fetal screening technologies were the cause of this problem. And they said it was just that China had always had more boys than girls, and had always had a skewed sex rate at birth. However, I think going into the late 80s and early 90s, it became clear that this was a much bigger problem, and authorities were forced to acknowledge that these technologies were being used on a wide scale to sex selectively choose babies and abort those that were female. At that point, sex selective abortion became illegal, but it still remained widespread for, I want to say, another 10 or 15, 20 years. Yeah.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you for both presentations, really interesting. I'm interested in single motherhood, and I wondered if you could say something about the attitudes of both the states to that, because, well, I know, Esther, you said that there was a kind of selective pronatalism, again, and single or unmarried women were therefore not encouraged to have children. But so if you could say a bit more, because I'm thinking just really quickly of the Soviet case. So in the post-war years, they reintroduced the category of illegitimacy to encourage men to get multiple women pregnant without worrying about the consequences. And then they set up it, and then the quid pro quo for the women was to say, well, if you're unmarried and have this baby, the state will take care of it and you can give it up to an institution. Yeah, so I just wondered if you could just make some comments about how single motherhood was treated. Thank you.
I guess I'll begin. This is something that really interests me because I think part of the bedrock of how modern Chinese society is constructed is based on the heteronormative nuclear family. And so there was no place for single mothers in any, so my book looks at an 100-year period, and at no point in that 100-year period is being a single mother considered an acceptable practice. And given the demographic shift with the population aging and decreasing fertility rates and things like that, activists keep asking when are single mothers, when are LGBTQ folks going to be brought into the fold? Because as of right now, single mothers and queer families are not eligible for maternity leave, for healthcare benefits, for all of the things that heteronormative married couples are eligible for. And there hasn't been a push to, I don't see an institutional push to accept single mothers. In fact, single mothers are, as far as I know, as of today, they're still forbidden from freezing their eggs or undergoing surrogacy, any of these sort of things that would perpetuate a single mom lifestyle. Where was I going with that? But I heard an anecdote recently that, and this wouldn't have happened, I don't think, 20 years ago. Apparently, some government people are being posted outside of hospitals where young unmarried women are being tested for pregnancy, and they're standing out there encouraging them to go forward with the pregnancy, saying kind of what you said in the Soviet Union: the state will take on your baby, just carry it to term, please don't have an abortion, which is something that would never, ever have been said 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago in China.
Yeah, thanks for the question. What I can say is that it was not the same in all the country contexts of Eastern Europe. But one of the first legal measures on the protection of mothers and children introduced in the early 50s in numerous state socialist countries did include the equalization of children born out of wedlock, which was a great, it was a great change in comparison to the pre-World War II context, up to when these women and children were very much disadvantaged in many ways. Yes, in the Hungarian context, I think it was single motherhood was socially not that accepted as, for example, as I could infer from literature around East Germany. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? If not, I want to. Oh, yes, Sarah.
Can I ask her a question?
Yes, of course.
I wanted to know a little bit about the types of the technologies for abortion in the period that you're studying. Was like what was the normal way of having an abortion in Hungary or in any of the contexts that you studied?
Thanks, Sarah. I haven't studied this in detail, so I can't really give you a very accurate answer. It differed across the decades of the state socialist period, and depended on to what extent abortion was liberalized, and also the available technologies and what preconditions women had to fulfill. But the actual medical technologies, I haven't looked into that, so I unfortunately cannot give you an answer.
Thank you. That's fine.
Thanks. I have some questions, but I wanted to start with I wanted to start with one about the sterilization, because we were discussing about family planning, right? And family planning and sterilization is like a big point on family planning for all the presentations here. And also I work from the Latin American perspective, particularly from Ecuador. And the sterilization is also a big thing, even today. Like, it's the preferred method of contraception, which still strikes me as very interesting considering the availability of other technologies, right? So I wanted to know, first, I realized in your presentation, Sarah, that you make a comment about how male sterilization was perceived as creating an imbalance in the body, as something that will make an unhealthy body, while female sterilization, I believe, won't have that similar reading. So maybe I will want to ask if there is anything about the feeling that someone gets imbalance when the sterilization comes from a woman's body. And then maybe I wanted to ask in both cases about the context of it. Why would it be preferred? Is it in the Latin American case or in the Ecuadorian case that I'm studying right now? I believe it's less judged by society because it becomes more a private decision than acquiring or getting periodical access to contraception, from condoms to hormones to any particular device. And it becomes once a decision, you're not judged anymore for society. I am exploring that as an alternative. But I wanted to know, in your case, what is the context around that decision? Is this framed as empowering or as optional or as desired or valuable? What are the context of sterilizations in your cases? Thank you.
In response to your first question about sterilization as denoting an imbalance within the body, my sense is that it creates the same imbalance within all bodies, male, female, or otherwise. However, there's less attention to whether women perceive themselves as experiencing an imbalance. So even though it probably, the sterilization would have the same result for anyone, it's only the male qualms about it that are paid attention to. And specifically, sterilization, at least in the Chinese context, for a generation who came of age and had children in the 1950s and 1960s in mainland China, having a sterilization would have been a source of empowerment because it would have been voluntary and consensual, and it would have been something that the patients actively sought. Whereas in the 1970s up through the 2010s, sterilization in almost all cases was involuntary, was not a choice. It was as part of a state mandated policy. It depends on where a person lived, where they had a residence permit, their class background, and there's a variety of different factors that determine how many children a person can have at a given time. But in most cases, a sterilization was either mandated after the birth of a woman's first child or after the birth of a second child. So sterilization, like the language of choice really doesn't play into sterilization from the late 70s up through nearly the present.
Maybe can I ask, and in the present, with this small change in the propaganda that you show, that bigger families, bigger ideas, now even now the idea of sterilization is still not about choice?
So with the rollback of the one-child policy in 2015, that has changed, but my sense is that sterilizations and IUDs are extremely unpopular for the same reason, and that is because the female sterilization and IUDs were the two primary technologies of state-enforced family planning. So for a younger generation who is now being given the choice, they know what their mother's experience and their friends' experience. And so and literally any other option looks more appealing than those two.
What I know about sterilization is related to literature that I have read related to the Czechoslovakian case. So I don't know if I should go into details about that. I haven't studied it myself in terms of primary research. What I know from literature on Czechoslovakia, that this ethnically neutral decree was introduced to restrict sterilization as much as possible and limit it. And what literature discusses is, especially Sokolova and Donner, is that the fact that there was an overrepresentation of forced sterilization among Romani women, nevertheless, was due to the fact how those very limited cases, the description of those cases that were vague in a way and were about eugenically undesirable birth, overlapped with the characterization of Roma as unhealthy. And this is the way how then physicians who took the initiative to sterilize women without their consent believed that they were doing something good, not only for the state, but also for those women and their families.
Thank you. Esther, I also have a question. Please, let's do a last round of questions. If anyone has a burning question, please raise your hand. If not, I will ask my last question to Esther. You mentioned that it was the 1960s. Yes, there was this idea of discouraging some women to have abortions, but there was a predisposition for physicians to popularize for Roma women to control their reproduction, right? And I wanted to ask you how physicians did this. If you have an idea about the language, the methods that they prescribed, or yeah, how the physicians were pushing for this.
Yes, thank you for this question. I mean, there was a difference between how family planning was carried out according to social strata. The family planning centers were mostly attended by more educated, better informed couples and women, and these services were not that much used by especially those women who it was thought to be that limiting their family size would be necessary. And so one of the ways abortion or contraceptives were the information was brought to these families was through the nurses, the district nurses who regularly visited families and quite directly spoke to this subject and distributed also contraceptives when those were available. This was one of the ways, and then some of the interviews I did. I mean, there were physicians who recalled that less educated women needed different types of contraceptives, so they wouldn't be able to take, for example, the pill because they weren't that controlled and weren't that intelligent, maybe, to use those contraceptives, and for them other means were necessary, such as UIDs, yeah, and that were under the control of the physician. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw, Susan, did you have one question?
Yes, I did, but Esther just kind of answered it. I'm sorry, I think I was reacting something other than a raised hand. I'm going to the opticians next week. But yeah, so I was wondering about these campaigns, and so I think, Esther, what you're saying about the family planning centers kind of answer that in some ways. But I was just wondering, I think you also mentioned the Red Cross in your presentation. So for both Sarah and Esther, I guess, who was charged really with undertaking these various campaigns? You know, who were the kind of the health educators, who was involved in kind of running these family planning centers, and then I guess as well sort of the you know, who visited these, and do we know how these kind of campaigns were received? I think, Sarah, you mentioned in your interviews that people seem to kind of internalize a lot of the rhetoric. So I'm just wondering if that was something you see as quite commonplace.
I mean, I can just, thank you for the question. I can just add to what I have said, that the Red Cross was involved in different types of work that we would call today social work, that wasn't called at the time as such. And among others, as this brochure illustrates, also in family planning issues. But further details to their practical, how such a brochure then was distributed, or I haven't encountered people who have read it, or I mean, I haven't looked into that side of their work. Yeah.
I talk a lot about this in my book, but in China, one of the kind of interesting and perhaps smarter moves that the government made was the kind of backbone of the family planning movement in the 1980s was women who did not have access to family planning in the 50s and 60s. So the women who had these enormous families and whose bodies had taken an enormous toll from consecutive pregnancies became the women spearheading these aggressive family planning campaigns in the 70s, 80s, and beyond. They're called like old ayis or nannies, and they would go door to door proselytizing about the benefits of family planning. So that's one way that this kind of rhetoric was spread, but there's myriad different ways that people would have interacted with state family planning rhetoric, through posters, through mandatory thought sessions at work, where they would be forced to read guides about how to use contraception in a group setting with their coworkers and bosses, which sounds terrible. Also by reading plays, these heart-wrenching plays about women who had too many children. So there were like many different ways of propagating this information. And it's actually like a really complex web of strategies to pull the user in.
Thank you. Thank you for those amazing presentations, for great responses. And of course, thank you for all the people that are here listening to these presentations and asking really good questions. I think we can finish our presentations here and let Sarah go to teach now. Thank you for the